It has not been an offseason full of flashy moves for the New York Jets, and understandably, some fans are a little worried. Is this team moving in the right direction? Well, I think there's a lot of reasons to feel good about what the Jets are doing, and I'll explain what they are today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Thursday, March 27th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. And today's episode is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Well, on today's show, I'd like to answer a listener email. Each Wednesday, we do a mailbag show. So on yesterday's show, we did a mailbag episode, but I got a detailed question from a listener named Vincent, who's a little concerned about the team's direction, what the moves the team has made or not made this offseason. And I felt like it was a detailed enough question to dedicate an entire episode to, rather than just a couple minutes in the mailbag episode. And I'm sure Vincent has I'm sure there are a lot of people who have the same concerns as Vincent. So I think that this is a really good topic to discuss. So Vincent wrote an email to me. He said, "John, I love the show. I never miss an episode. Keep up the great work. While I usually agree with you on most Jets topics, I think you're being a bit too optimistic on the Jets offseason so far." And Vincent then listed a number of concerns that he had. So I'm going to go spend this episode going through Vincent's concerns. And like I said, I'm sure he's not the only one who feels this way. So I'll give you Vincent's concerns and I'll give you my responses to all of them. So Vincent's number one concern is about the guy the Jets hired as head coach, Aaron Glenn. The hiring of Aaron Glenn, another first-time head coach, should be met with more skepticism. His defenses were never dominant. I'm sure we will have a few first-year hiccups. Now, I don't think that's unfair. Glenn is a first-time head coach, and we don't really have a sense for how good of a head coach he's going to be. And I agree with you, Vincent. I think it's fair to expect a few hiccups along the way. That's true of anybody starting a new job. I'll tell you, every new job I've ever had, there have been aspects of the job I never expected and never planned on. And there have been growing pains. And when you're hiring a first-time head coach, in many ways, you're kind of going on potential for the guy. You're hoping that he learns his craft, but you know that there are going to be mistakes made along the way. That's true of Aaron Glenn. It's true of pretty much anybody who was hired as a first-time head coach this offseason. I do think that the fan base is a little worried about Glenn for reasons that are a bit unfair, though. And that's because in Woody Johnson's tenure as owner, every single head coach except Adam Gase was a first-time head coach from the defensive side of the ball. Herm Edwards, first-time head coach from the defensive side of the ball. Eric Mangini, same thing. Rex Ryan, same thing. Todd Bowles, same thing. Adam Gase was the exception. He was an offensive guy with experience. Then Robert Saleh, first-time head coach, defensive side of the ball. And while some of these coaches had some degree of success, Herm Edwards made the playoffs 3 times in 5 years. Rex Ryan, obviously phenomenal success his first 2 years, 2 straight trips to the AFC Championship game, a few plays here or there. The Jets could have gone to the Super Bowl twice. Todd Bowles even won 10 games his first year. The Jets have not been able to find their long-term head coach. And I think that there's some degree of belief in the fan base that just because in the past, first-time head coaches with a defensive background have not panned out, that Aaron Glenn's going to be the exact same thing. But Aaron Glenn's a different person. And the one thing I would rebut is the idea that Glenn's defense is not being phenomenal has an outsized impact on how well he'll do as a head coach. I think that being a coordinator is very different from being a head coach. When you're a coordinator, you're in charge of one unit. You're focused on either making the offense or the defense really good. Being the head coach is a different job. Being the head coach means you're overseeing everything. And that means you're in charge of the coaches. One of the things Todd Bowles, I remember, mentioned that Bill Parcells it was a Bill Parcellsism, that your most important job is coaching the coaches. And while you have a degree of responsibility as a coordinator, when you're the head coach, you're overseeing everything. You're overseeing the offensive coaches, the defensive coaches, and you're providing like an overall leadership mindset to the team in a way that you're not as a coordinator. I don't think that there's a lot that's transferable from your success as a coordinator to a head coach. If you think about it, Sean McVay, one of the best offensive minds in the league, he was a coordinator for 4 years in Washington before he went to the Rams. In those 4 years in Washington, he had one top 5 scoring offense. He had one big year, but other than that, his offenses really weren't that phenomenal. So, I think there's more to it than just like looking at the rankings of a coach's unit, because every single year there are guys who, the hot coordinator who comes in, he's either like really overachieved on the defensive side of the ball or really overachieved on the offensive side of the ball, and they get a head coaching job and they find out it's an entirely different job. There's not a lot to judge Aaron Glenn on so far. The one thing I would judge him on is the way the Aaron Rodgers situation was handled. And I think the Jets handled it well. I think it would have been very easy to drag this out all offseason. I think it would have been very easy to, turn this into a dramatic thing. Will he come back or will he won't? Because he's dragging out his decision right now. It's not clear whether he's going to come back now. And the Jets could be in the middle of this. It also would have been very easy to play into the media narrative to, make fans happy, bring him back, talk him up, talk about how, he's a year removed from his injury. Now he's feeling fully healthy. Now he'll have a full offseason with Devontae Adams. It would have been very easy to hype this team up again. But they saw that the right move was not the popular move. And that's something I appreciate. Other than that, I think Glenn has handled his press conference as well, shown himself to be good with the media. We don't really know how good he's going to be. But I don't meet Glenn initially with skepticism, though. I think that, I think that it's fair to say that we don't know how good he's going to be. It's fair to say that the Jets are following a similar pattern, hiring the first time defense. I wouldn't say that we should be overly concerned with Aaron Glenn. I don't think we should be more pessimistic on Glenn than we would be any other first-time head coach. So that's how I would respond to the first point. The second point, Tanner Engstrand, a first-time play caller, was passed over by two former employers. The Lions did not promote him, and Ben Johnson did not bring him to Chicago. Why should we be optimistic after the people who know him best don't want him? That's not an unfair point again. I think Vincent's making fair points, but I guess maybe my view is a little bit more glasses half full. Like, I think that is something to consider, but I think the best rebuttal I would have would be, does that mean that nobody who's ever been passed over, does that mean anybody who's been passed over for a job should be persona non grata? It's possible Tanner Engstrand's a really good coach, and Dan Campbell, who I really respect, just thought there was a better fit. That doesn't necessarily reflect poorly on Tanner Engstrand. Another thing I'd say is that, yes, Dan Campbell knows Tanner Engstrand. Yes, Ben Johnson knows Tanner Engstrand, but Aaron Glenn knows him too. And sometimes what happens is, a defensive coach really identifies somebody he wants to run. He kind of says, if I ever get a head coaching job, that's where I want to run my offense. So he may have just gone to Tanner Engstrand, and maybe he and Tanner Engstrand bonded during their time together in Detroit. And maybe Glenn and Engstrand said, if Glenn's ever a head coach, I want to run his offense. But more than anything, I can't tell you how a first-time head coordinator is going to do any more than I can tell you how a first-time head coach is going to do. It's a projection. At the time he was hired, Mike LaFleur made a lot of sense back in 2021 when the Jets brought him over from San Francisco. He fit the profile you wanted. Just fitting the profile you want doesn't guarantee you're going to be a great coordinator. But I think about what are the attributes I'd want in the next Jets offensive coordinator. I want someone who's kind of like a young up-and-comer. I want somebody who's exposed to really modern passing concepts because the game is evolving. Offensive systems are evolving. I want someone who's at the cutting edge. And, I want somebody who seems like a rising star. And based on the buzz, that kind of seems like Tanner Engstrand is. Now, it's fair to say that Tanner Engstrand, was passed over by Dan Campbell. I would push back a little bit on the idea Ben Johnson passed him over, because I think Engstrand was always viewed as kind of the heir apparent to Detroit. So I think if you want to say Dan Campbell passed him over, I could agree with that. But there's only so much that matters. Look, when Dan Campbell was a player with the New York Giants, there was an offensive coordinator there. His offensive coordinator was stripped of his play calling duties. That offensive coordinator was Sean Payton. Careers have peaks and valleys. Sometimes you're down. Sometimes you're up. When you're up, that doesn't mean you're the greatest guy in the world. When you're down, that doesn't mean you're irredeemable. And I understand the concern. I would say that it's a fair critique, but I would not say it's disqualifying. I think that you can be a good coach and be passed over for a job, even on the team you work for. I think that there are plenty of coaches through the history of the league who have been passed over for jobs that they've wanted. And ended up being really high caliber coaches. Bill Walsh, I don't want to compare him to Bill Walsh because Bill Walsh is one of the greatest coaches of all time, but Bill Walsh was passed over. Bill Walsh was really hurt. He's passed over for the Cincinnati Bengals job. He was the Bengals offensive coordinator before he became the 49ers head coach. So sometimes guys, I'm not saying Tanner Engstrand, please do not reply to me and say Tanner Engstrand is not, I'm not saying he's Bill Walsh, but what I'm saying is that sometimes a guy can pan out even if he's passed over for a job. being passed over is not disqualifying. That's the point I'm making. Now, you're on the Locked On Jets podcast. We'll continue to talk about some of the questions you may have about the Jets offseason so far. Let's turn our attention to some of the player acquisitions, including the questions about the most important player the Jets signed, Justin Fields. There are some understandable concerns, but I think there's real upside there, and I'll explain why as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by Gametime. Imagine watching your favorite team live, feeling the energy of the crowd and witnessing unforgettable moments. There's nothing like experiencing the big game in person. Well, getting tickets should not be stressful. That's where Gametime comes in, making it easier than ever to grab last-minute seats at unbeatable prices. You could just check Gametime's app and you will find amazing deals on huge matchups coming up. Their lowest price guarantee. Gametime will credit you 100%, 110% of the difference if you find a lower price somewhere else. And with seat views before you buy, no surprise fees, and a lowest price guarantee, you can book with total confidence. I don't just tell you about Gametime. I've used it myself on numerous occasions. Last minute tickets. I can't believe the deals I've gotten. Again, that view from your seat's really important because you don't want to show up at your venue and have some obstruction that you're not expecting. That doesn't happen with Gametime because you get that view from your seat. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Again, that's code LOCKEDONNFL. It's one word with no space, LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price, guaranteed. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you, everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Let's continue now. We're going through some concerns a listener sent me about the offseason the Jets are having, and I'm going through point by point about his concerns and kind of responding, giving my own perspective on them. The next point Vincent raised is Justin Fields is a historic turnover machine who struggles mightily to read defenses and consistently misses open receivers. Garrett Wilson might be happy his college friend is there now, but I don't know how he will feel when he's running wide open and Fields cannot find him. Fields has 44 fumbles in his career and averaged 7.7 yards per throw last year. He was benched by the Steelers, a much more adept organization compared to the Jets. Furthermore, his struggles as a pocket passer will bring down the offensive line. So again, I don't think Vincent's points are outrageous here. I don't think his concerns are really, are really over the top. If Justin Fields was that good to this point in his career, he would not have been available. The issue is that the Jets did not have an ideal option at the quarterback position. When you need a quarterback in the NFL, you're typically looking at options that are really not that great. So for me, the two questions were, what's the least bad option and what's the option with the most upside? Now, if we were talking about what Justin Fields has done to date in his career, he would not be a very appealing option because he's struggled. As Vincent mentioned, two organizations have given up on him. But there are two points I'd like to make here. One is, Vincent mentioned the average 7.7 yards per attempt last year. League average was 7.1. So that was a promising sign. The other point that Vincent mentioned was that the Steelers benched him. Again, that's true, but the Steelers did want him back. And we know right now the Steelers are kind of in the mix for Aaron Rodgers. Well, the Steelers made a play for Fields before they made a play for Rodgers. So we're talking about what the Pittsburgh Steelers are doing. The Pittsburgh Steelers also prioritize Justin Fields over Aaron Rodgers. So that's a point. That's another point I'd like to make. But with Fields, it's an upside play. A year ago, would you have said the Vikings made a good move signing Sam Darnold? One of the things I think we've seen in the NFL over the last couple of years is sometimes teams ask too much too soon from young quarterbacks. And that's certainly something we're familiar with as Jets fans. The Jets certainly asked too much out of Sam Darnold. In fact, whenever Sam Darnold was here, it felt like whenever the Jets made a mistake, they just kind of said, well, it's not a big deal because we have Sam Darnold. Sam will bail us out. And Darnold was a quarterback who really needed a lot of development. He was still quite a long way. He was still pretty early in his career. He was very young when the Jets drafted him, and the Jets just put too much on his plate. And the same was true with Geno Smith when he was here. Jets threw him into an impossible situation where he had no good receivers. There were no playmakers around him. You see this across the league. Young quarterbacks struggle, and increasingly over the last couple of years, and Sam and Geno are two examples. These quarterbacks get a little mature. They learn how to read. They spend a couple of years as backups. They learn how to read defenses. They learn how to progress through receivers on passing plays, and suddenly they learn how to play. And I think the hope is the same thing with Fields. Fields is a guy with a lot of ability. And as I mentioned this on the show the other day, is that I recently researched an article for my website, GanggreenNation.com, and I took a look at what percentage of Fields's games where he threw 20 passes to date, where he was able to have 100+ quarterback passer rating. And it was about the same percentage as Darnold had prior to last season. So what that told me is that Fields does have upside, that there is untapped talent in him. And as you mentioned, like, he did have pretty good numbers last year in Pittsburgh before he was benched. So look, this is really about, was he the best option available? And I think the answer to that is yes. Did he have the most upside? Again, I think the answer to that is yes. I understand. Like, I understand the concerns. I'm not sitting here telling you Justin Fields is going to be a superstar. And I guess this is the theme, is that when I say I'm positive on these moves, that doesn't mean that, like, I think that these are can't miss moves. I don't think that these are moves that are guaranteed to work. It's just, I look at what the options the Jets had were, and I feel like these were probably the highest percentage plays that they had. The next point Vincent raises, talking about the offensive line, they let a team leader in Morgan Moses go and replaced him with a guy on the extreme downturn of his career. The guy was benched the last 2 seasons, with last year's benching happening in the first half of the first game. Okay, well, as far as letting Morgan Moses go, Morgan Moses is 34. I don't think you could give him a 3-year contract, and Morgan Moses is on the downside of his career. As much, like, I would have liked to have seen the Jets be able to retain Morgan Moses on a cheap deal, but Morgan Moses's market was far greater than I anticipated. I thought Morgan Moses would be available after the draft. It's just, there's such an offensive line crisis in the league that, even at 34, on the downside of his career, Moses was able to attract a number of suitors. Look, if your argument is that Okorafor should not be starting at right tackle, I agree with you. If the plan is to start him at right tackle, then I'm actually 100% with Vincent on this one. The reason I like the move is, first of all, I'm assuming they aren't going to start him at right tackle. But second of all, it's that they didn't pay much for him. This is a guy with starting experience. And, he hasn't been very good the last 2 years. But if you compare him with, like, other backup tackles in the league, he probably would be one of the better ones. But I'm willing to let this play out. I'm not ready to bash this move yet. I will be with Vincent if they put him at right tackle, because I think that will be a problem. I don't think he's a guy you'd want to trust starting at right tackle for the reasons Vincent mentioned. He's been benched the last 2 years. But if the plan is to get another right tackle and to have Okorafor be the kind of the backup, the primary backup, well, then I think you're in decent shape, because I think he's good. He's better than a lot of the primary backups in the league. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, I'll tie it all together. I'll explain to you how I view this offseason, because one theme you should be getting right now is I don't think anything the Jets have done this offseason is a grand slam. It's just more evaluating the process of how they're thinking, and that's really important. I'll explain why as we continue here on this Thursday edition of Locked On Jets. This is the Locked On Jets podcast on this Thursday. We're talking about reasons for skepticism for Jets fans may have, and why I'm relatively optimistic about how this team's approached the offseason. And we're going through, it was a mailbag question from a listener, Vincent, who a little worried about the way the Jets are operating. So we're going point by point. Vincent had a number of points. His next point, on the defensive side of the ball, the cornerback signing was horrible. The guy allowed over 100 passer rating and 800 yards receiving. Even the safety we signed is coming off a bad year. The defensive linemen they signed are not good either. Weaver is at best a minimal pass rushing success, and the interior linemen are not going to do much to stop the run. Again, like, I actually kind of agree with that. So I'll break that up into a number of points. Brandon Stephens, that was a questionable signing, giving Brandon Stephens around $13 million a year. The question is, and this is something we don't know yet, because we don't have a good feel for how good this staff is at finding players. But the teams that do best in free agency are able to identify talents that nobody else can identify, and or guys who are maybe better fit here than they are elsewhere. And it's tough to do that with Baltimore. Look, Brandon Stephens comes from Baltimore. Those guys know what they're doing. But last year, the Jets signed John Simpson from Baltimore. And I don't think John Simpson's contract justified his play prior to coming to the Jets. He wasn't good enough in Baltimore to earn the type of money the Jets gave him. But the Jets saw something in him. They saw a good fit. They saw a player who was ascending. And John Simpson ended up being a pretty good value. I think the hope is that they'll do this. Brandon Stephens will do the same. Brandon Stephens has been a fairly effective corner in man coverage. He's really struggled in zone. The Jets are going to run a lot of man this year. He's big. He conceivably has the build to be a decent pressed corner. That's more of a to be determined. I was not crazy about that move. I would have liked the move if they gave him, maybe half the money they gave him. But I'm willing to let this play out to see like how well this works out, because this is like a projection move, and the front offices and coaching staffs that are good, they're able to figure out which projection moves work. They're projecting Brandon Stevens is going to be better in New York than he was in Baltimore. We'll find out whether they're right or not. Fair to be concerned, but I'm willing to let that play out. The question about Andre Sisco, he wasn't good in Jacksonville last year. Well, to me, that's the type of guy you should get in a free agency. You should try and find a guy whose value is maybe a little bit lower than it should be. Andre Sisco was bad last year, but the 2 years prior to that, he was very good. He fits a very important role for the Jets, that single high safety. He's got good instincts. He got good ball skills, been a pretty frequent interception guy through his career. So I like that move. I thought that was the kind of move the Jets should be making. They got him, and because he didn't have a good year last year in a chaotic situation in Jacksonville, they got him on a pretty favorable deal. I'm not going to defend the defensive line signings. I don't think they've added anybody worthwhile on the defensive line. So I'm with you on that one, Vincent. I'm not going to debate that. And Vincent's last point is back to the quarterback position. In 2025, we're either trying to revive Fields' career or develop a quarterback that we draft at some point. The success of this is another huge question mark. The position coach tasked with this has no success in doing that. What type of hire was that? This screams of Glenn hiring a friend that is not qualified for such an important position. So the coach the Jets hired was Charles London. And I mean, I honestly think that, like, for the most part, these position coaches are overrated. I think they get too much credit when players succeed and take too much blame when they fail. I think there are maybe a handful of position coaches who make a genuine difference, and everyone else is just kind of there. They're kind of like they either succeed because the players are good, or they fail because the players are bad. And I think they become a very easy target, because if your team is struggling, it's very difficult to get rid of your players during the season, but it's very easy to blame the coaches, because the coaches, I think it's a situation, if your players aren't good enough, then your team's in trouble. If your coaching isn't good enough, then the coach just has to improve. The coach just has to coach better. But I don't think Charles London's going to be the guy that makes or breaks Justin Fields. I mean, I looked at Tanner Engstrand more, and as we've discussed, Tanner Engstrand's a bit of a wild card. I'm not going to sit here and tell you Tanner Engstrand's the next great offensive line. And again, I'm not saying he's Bill Walsh just because I made that comparison a little bit earlier, but I think Justin Fields will succeed or fail mostly on his own ability. How much can he learn? How much can he develop? How much better can he become at maneuvering the pocket? And yeah, I understand the coach's job is to help him learn, but like on some level, a guy can either do it or he can't. And coaching is not going to. Coaching can only do so much. Vincent writes, I disagreed with your thoughts that the team could improve from last year. They hired rookie coaches to lead the staff and the offense. They brought in free agents coming off their worst career years, and they downgraded at the quarterback position. I see this as a rebuild year that will likely lead to a 3 to 4 win season at best, which will likely lead to massive movement on the roster, including the possibility that talent such as Quinnen Williams, Sauce Gardner, or Garrett Wilson will be moved for draft capital. Okay, so a couple of points about that. Yes, they hired rookie coaches. It's very difficult to conceive of a scenario, though, where this coaching staff is not an upgrade over last year's coaching staff. And I know everybody says that after they fire their coaching staff, but like Jeff Ulbrich was not a head coach. He was not prepared to be a head coach. The Jets threw him into an impossible situation where he didn't know what he was doing. Glenn might be a bad head coach, but he's going to be better than Jeff Ulbrich. That's a virtual guarantee. Engstrand may not be good, but odds are he's going to be better than Nathaniel Hackett, and then Todd Downing. Those were two not good offensive coaches. Those were two of the worst offensive coaches in the league. And the fact Downing looked good by comparison, I think shows more than anything how bad Hackett was. So when you talk about we downgraded the coaching staff, I think we've upgraded the coaching staff. You say we've downgraded the quarterback position. I think this is actually one of the biggest points of contention, one of the biggest misperceptions out there, saying we've downgraded the quarterback position. Aaron Rodgers was not good last year. Aaron Rodgers was probably like the 25th best quarterback in the league last year. And nobody wants to say this because it's Aaron Rodgers. And I think in the national media, there's a lot of fear about just like saying that Aaron Rodgers isn't that good anymore. And it's ironic because Aaron Rodgers like views himself as like the most persecuted player in the NFL when he's maybe like the least criticized player relative to like his actual performance, and has been the last couple of years. Aaron Rodgers has not been an above average quarterback since he won the MVP in 2021. He was below average in 2022. He was injured the entire year in 2023. 2024, I mean, look at the numbers. Outside of like the raw counting stats, outside of like touchdown passes, which is not a particularly significant metric, Aaron Rodgers was not good last year. And there's a very good chance Justin Fields is at least as good as him this year. because Fields is probably about the 25th best starting quarterback in the league. I think he's a low-level starter, but he could be better. He could improve. And I don't see how we're falling to 3 or 4 wins. We won 5 last year, and the team was kind of unlucky. I mean, the team had horrible coaching. The team had worse coaching than it will this year. The team, it was a chaotic situation. The owner was creating a new chaotic situation that distracted the team on a week-to-week basis. And the team was a little unlucky in close games. Now, I think like people go overboard and say, well, if we just had a kicker, we would have made the playoffs, because a lot of those games, the Jets lost on their own merit. A lot of those games, the Jets were lucky to be in a situation where a kick would have won it. I mean, that's actually one of the lost facts of the lost factors of the 2024 Jets. People talk about the kicker costing them games, but when they ignore the fact that the Jets never should have been in a position where it came down to a kick, and the Jets had only themselves to blame in a lot of those games that it came down to a kick when they should have, been in a more comfortable situation. But Jets were a little snake bitten in close games. And I think like this plays into like a bigger point that I've made. Expectations are going to be low for this team. Last year, expectations were too high. People overrated the team. People are now like maybe underrating the same team. And you look at the guys the Jets have lost. Outside of DJ Reed and maybe Morgan Moses, I don't see a lot of guys that were that valuable. Yeah, a lot of guys have left, but like how many of them like actually were making a positive difference for the team? And DJ Reed, Morgan Moses, that's it. And more than anything, what I would say is I'm not judging. There's only so much you can judge these guys on because they inherited a situation where the salary cap was not good. So what I try and judge them on is what are they making the types of moves they should be making? Because in a situation like the Jets, you have to bet on upside. You have to bet on upside, bet on upside as an offensive coordinator, bet on upside for a quarterback. So are they taking chances on guys who have a resume that suggests that like there could be legitimate big improvement? And I think the answer to that is yes. I focus on process a lot because right now the Jets the Jets could not build a Super Bowl caliber team this offseason. So the question is, are they making the types of bets they should be making? I think the answer to that is yes. So that's how I would respond to all of Vincent's points. And to be honest with you, like I actually agree with a lot of Vincent's points. And Vincent, I hope you don't take offense to this. And if you ever like to come on the show and rebut any of my arguments, you have an open invitation because I used your mailbag question for a full show. So please, Vincent, if you ever want to come on, you can certainly feel free. But that's why like I'm actually a little bit more more optimistic than a lot of people are on the Jets right now, because I kind of seeing the glass half full right now, and I think that they've made a lot of moves that make sense. But anyway, I'd love to hear your thoughts. That's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast source, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Thursday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.